My name's Guy. I'd like to introduce a subject: the death of religion and the birth of the spiritual. So I'm going to be sharing something of my personal story, but at the same time invite you to listen to that which is belonging to the collective or the universal story, and to see if any of this touches you or relates or resonates with you. So the death of religion sounds like a strong subject, but I really want to go into this and to share with you and show you what this means for me. This is not just a revolutionary position or a rejection position. This is coming from a place of deep realization of that takes me into and as the spiritual. And perhaps just considering the possibility that religion is not the only or the best way, approach, or method to do this, that there are other alternatives. In some ways, we're in a post-religious age. Some people have moved into a more scientific basis of living and experiencing their lives. And there's also an absence or a loss of the spiritual, because these two things were put together. There's often been a link or an assumption of a link between religion and spirituality. And I'd like to be able to speak to you openly and honestly and show you how in my case that this link is actually very ambient, fragile. It's an assumption, and when looked into in depth and honesty with open eyes and open mind, open-heartedness, start to realize that this link isn't really there or hasn't been for me. So my journey began as a boy living in the countryside in Somerset, and I was a-religious, wasn't really atheist or agnostic, was just very much into living in and through my body and nature, and playing with friends from the village and cycling, climbing trees, fishing, just really engaging with life outside in the countryside. And this was my experience for until I was about age 12. This was a big turning point for me at age 12, because I went from this contented, simple, easy village life of connection and everyday pleasures and joys and hanging out with friends and just experiencing the simplicity that often comes when living in the countryside, which I certainly felt. Not taking it for granted, just really enjoying being amongst the trees and the hills and the big blue skies and clouds and stars and sounds of animals all the time. We had horses as well, so there's a very strong kinesthetic, sensual experience of being in and with nature. If you've read much of Wordsworth or Coleridge, who also wrote poetry on the Quantock Hills, which is very close to where I was brought up, then they talk about this immanence of nature, this presence, this overwhelming, fully passionate, felt, sensed experience of being engaged with something other than the constructs of the mind. Like the sensation of the full embrace of nature, where nature takes you in such a way that it moves you beyond thinking, beyond interpreting, beyond judging or opinionating, into direct contact. And often I would have these reveries, if you like, or inspirational moments of just being in awe with the landscape that I lived in. So I would consider in reflection these early years, first 12 years of my life, very spiritual years, but without any interpretation, without any naming, without any need for belief or support from ideas or behavioral codes, just the purity and simplicity of embodied natural existence. So this was my experience up to about age 12. Then at 12, I was taken off to school, to boarding school, a place called Downside in Somerset near Bath. And if you don't know this, the boarding schools are based on an ancient Spartan idea where you get to make a man or make a leader. It's a rite of passage, if you like, from boy to manhood, where you're severed from the family ties and thrown in with the wolves to find your own way. And that really was what it was like, this sense of like an umbilical cord cut with my family and the natural world and my friends and the everyday simplicity of life that I was used to and familiar with. Suddenly I was thrown into a den of lions and really noticed my masculine energy surging in a protective mechanism. This sensation of being taken to Plunkett House I was originally, which is what they call a preparatory school, preparing you for the bigger boarding school. And this place was situated next to a graveyard, and I arrived there. It's a long straight road, a Roman road, and I think it was raining, it was dark, it felt like it was nighttime, and it felt like this road was going on forever with my mum and dad driving me to this alien place. And coming across these sort of grey buildings on a dark night and with a graveyard beside it and big old trees hanging over the building, just felt this gloom and doom and terror, actually, this sadness inside of me, this emptying out of my belly and my heart, and realization this was it. I was now being taken away from home. And, I cried and cried and cried as my parents left. Watched them waving to them as they drove back on this long, straight, endless Roman road, leaving me there. So it was very intense severing. And it's this, like a rude awakening. I'm alone now. That's what it felt like. It felt this severance of a very kinesthetic, simple, friendship-based, natural, world-based way of being, which, as I said earlier, this consideration, I would call that the spiritual, or a reference point of that being the spiritual, where there's a joyful aliveness and ease of being as a consistent. Now here I was at Plunkett House, alone, and one of the first things that happened, or I remember happening, was we were told to go to this room, unpacked our bags and that kind of thing, and maybe had some food, I don't know, can't remember the order of things, but I remember going to this room and it was prayer time. And up until that point, I hadn't really considered even the nature of prayer, not really been in a consideration about religion, what it was. I kind of heard the word and kind of knew churches existed, but suddenly here I was in this room and everyone was kneeling down and prayers were being said. And I was parroting along and trying to, hear what was being expressed and copy and imitate. But inside, I was really having this death experience, this deep sadness and sorrow and sense of aloneness. Feeling left by my parents, left the life behind. And here I was with a group of strangers, boys and monks. It was a monastery school. So the feminine energy was no longer there. In that moment, kneeling down in this devastation and internal collapse, I heard the words of prayer that were being spoken. And I was lost and alone and scared and afraid and all sorts of things all at once. Overwhelmed, really, by the whole separation experience. And at the same time trying to hold it together, because I was there with a peer group of boys and not wanting to look like a mess, because recognizing this alpha male scenario that we get into as men, sometimes young men, and not wanting to be seen as wimp or crybaby and all these kind of definitions of sadness that suddenly came into my awareness, which were never there before. A good relationship before with my emotional body and ease of being without any judgment or resistance, and suddenly I was trying to hold tears back and deny feelings. And right in the middle of this, I start praying. I start praying with my whole heart, with this sense of like, if there is a God, come to me now. Like, I need to feel your presence. I'm alone, feel scared, feel lost. And, I remember closing my eyes and I had my hands together, kneeling down, and with this absolute intensity coming from my heart, asking for support, asking for help. No idea who I was asking or really how, but the intensity was there. The depth of passion and pleading and yearning was there. And in that moment, directly, like immediately, I felt this flooding of what I could later call grace. It's like a sensation of blessing and peace and calm. And I think we were doing the Hail Mary prayer at the time, and just feeling the blessing of what was, presented to us as the Virgin Mary or Mother Mary. This soothing, blue, calming energy just kind of swept through me, and I surrendered to it. It's like I needed something, and the blessing was given. Grace was given. That was my first ever experience of prayer, and it was like a direct hit. And it's like, wow, I thought this stuff is strong, It's like I was desperate, alone, scared, isolated, in fear, in my emotional body, feeling lost and defensive and shut down. And then from this place of like, I need help, there was this descending feeling. That's what it felt like. It felt like it was descending into me and just calming me, soothing me, harmonizing. So as you can imagine, I was quite surprised. But I wasn't surprised in that moment. It came to me later, this sense of surprise and awe and wonder and curiosity. There was such a huge shift from my experience that I was feeling, this sadness, this lostness, this isolation, to a sense of blessing and being held, like enveloped in the arms of love from an invisible force that I'd called forth, that I'd called for to come and bless me. Now, this happened in a prayer moment, and it could be easy to associate that prayer moment with religion, and that religious moment with a spiritual experience. But as I carry on talking about this, hopefully you'll start to see how I've learned to see it a bit differently. Now, I want to give you a picture of the school that I was in. It's Downside School, or Downside Abbey School, and it was one of the two places, together with Ampleforth up in Scotland, that they researched for Harry Potter films. It's made up of dormitories and grey buildings and winding staircases and different names of houses, and it had that kind of haunting feeling to it. And there's large trees around and a big, beautiful garden and lots of fields, sports fields, and it was set up a long drive. That's what it felt like anyway, to get there. And then just behind the school was this huge abbey. Now, this abbey has the most amazing acoustics. The Gregorian chanting that happens in there with the monks is a phenomena to behold. It's very, very beautiful to hear the sweet sounds of prayerful song, and how it's enchanting and enticing and seductive and welcoming and inviting, and draws you into a certain state of being. And I was in the choir for a while, so I experienced firsthand what it was like to be part of that unison song of the Gregorian choir. So it was very, very special. And again, the Gregorian choir, the chanting, the prayers that were being sung, which was all part of religious ceremony. And yet at the same time, in the middle of all of that, often I'd have these spiritual experiences and would associate them together with the singing. So I was always curious about cause and effect, and I was always a student of reflecting upon and inquiring about what just happened. Have this sense that there is a science to all things, and not necessarily the science as presented by the materialistic model or reductionist model, but maybe a meta-science, that somehow there are patterns and intelligences in all things. And if we observe and feel close enough and experiment deeply within ourselves, we can come to know or have an approximation upon knowing of certain things. And it's always been like this with me. At school I used to have the nickname Mr. Deep, because I would always be inquiring about things. So this moves me to another episode to share. I called for a private meeting with the abbot of the monastery and was called into his office at a certain time. And I had a little notebook. And one of my questions in this notebook was, what is the nature of reincarnation? And I want you to understand that this was a Catholic Christian monastery school. And this was not a regular question to put to the monks. And he did everything to sidestep and avoid this and not answer my question, and ended up serving me hot cocoa and toast, I think, and talking about something different. This was quite a turning point for me, because I'd gone there with an honest, inquiring heart, with a curiosity to ask questions about all things spiritual. And I thought the abbot of the monastery at least could give me some educated or informed or personal answer that would help me on my way of understanding and grasping and sensing. And there was a disappointment that it was completely avoided. There was no engagement. There was no place for this question. And this brought about all sorts of doubt inside of me about, can you question religion? Can you question what is set up to be a certain structural form with certain conditional elements? Can it be, it's not even challenging, just questioning, engaging subjectively, personally with it. So this was as a 12-year-old, I had this first sense of disappointment. Now shortly after then, or around that time, there was a group of boys and they were all plotting to do the Ouija board. And I didn't really know anything about this, but there was part of me, a 12-year-old boy, wanting to get in with the gang, get in with the tough guys, do something a bit scary and edgy. So it wasn't really about the Ouija board. It was more about just saying, I'm up for doing something terrifying. And so unconscious or conscious level as a way of kind of proving myself, trying to find my way into this tribe of boys. A bit like Lord of the Flies, really. These kind of strong initiation rituals. And we set up to do this Ouija board in the basement, which is where we used to get changed for games. And it happened to be under the headmaster's office. So you had to walk down these stairs, and there's one light on down there. And we set up this Ouija board, and I had this vision, I had this really strong feeling and sensation that the headmaster would come down before we started. So it was all laid out, everything ready to go, and we were all a bit terrified, but not really showing that, and just about to start asking questions and all sorts of things. And suddenly we heard the door open. Headmaster came down, and of course he was horrified, to find, I think it was 4 or 5 of us down there, practicing the Ouija board underneath his office. It's like the worst possible thing that could be discovered in a Catholic church scenario. Anyway, the very next day we were taken off to the abbey, and there was threats of exorcism, and we were given the fear of God and how it was terrible to look at these, and it was terrifying, and we told stories about other boys who'd done this, who'd gone mad, and it was like horrific fear-based conditioning that was drilled into us, that we were, not told directly sinners, but like we were really misguided and doing something stupid and dangerous, and we should not do this, and we were publicly shamed and humiliated. And for weeks after that, I was in terror, because somehow this fear of God and the wrath and the wrongdoing that apparently I'd been involved in was drilled into me. And I want to let you know, at the same time, it made me curious. It's like, wow, there's so much attack on this, if there's so much rebellion against this, so much refusal of this, there must be something in it. There must be something inside of what the Ouija board represents or is that has a power in it that doesn't want to be looked at or engaged in. It's been rejected by the church. So again, my curiosity got sparked. And I could argue and say this was the beginning of my deeper research into all things esoteric and mystical and unknown, and the curiosity of all things spiritual that I've been engaged in for many, many, many years. I can say thank you very much to the Catholic Church for showing me the contrast, this powerful contrast and fear-based conditional response to this activity. So then just fast forward for a few other little stories, and then I'm just going to give you a bit more context. interesting enough, most evenings, or maybe it wasn't every evening, but some evenings, our housemaster would come and tell us horror stories. We used to sleep in this dormitory on the top floor. Had these very thin windows, and which would bang and creak, and the wind would blow through, and he'd have a candle, and he'd be telling these horrific stories, ghost stories and things. And they were largely about stories that happened in the school as well, about things that happened in the past or named, so they were personalized. And sometimes I would get so scared, like my energy body would be so scared and terrified that I'd have to leave the room and go and hide out in the toilets. And then I'd also get scared of hiding in the toilets by myself. And this was partly because I was still living in the fear-based reality that was driven into me after the Ouija board experience, and we will exorcise you and we will do all these things to you, and you're bad and sinner and wrong and should never have done this. And the ghost story just added to this. Yeah. Now, I just want to give you a bigger context as well, something I'll talk about in another video, but I'd also been sexually abused before I came to school by a man in the village that I was living in. And this had happened just before I left for school, and I didn't tell anyone about this. I'd buried this. It was too traumatic for me to communicate. And so I had that terror going on, sexual abuse terror, this fear of being exercised, alone, isolated from the family, and in with this group of boys and monks telling horror stories every night. And maybe you don't want to believe this, but we had prefects there who would shoot us with blue tag as we were brushing our teeth. Really, all the terrifying stories of boarding school are true, or they were in my experience. You know, we had to run through gauntlets of people smashing with pillows and just to get to your bed and things. It's like there was some horrible, humiliating, degrading ways of dominance from the older boys to the younger boys to kind of put you in your place. Really was like Lord of the Flies in many, many ways. And all of this apparently to toughen you up, make you into a leader. And those of you who know me know that I'm very sensitive, I'm very empathic, very energetically aware of the subtlety of life. I've always been. And so this was all very exaggerated and amplified for me. So a tiny bit of fear became a big bit of terror for me. I was also bullied as well. This is not a sad story. It's not meant or intended as that, but it's like, you know, there was a lot of stuff going on, as well as puberty and trying to find my place in amongst all this new world I was in. Anyway, in the midst of this, we would have, you know, religious services probably a couple of times a week, and there'd be a big service on a Sunday we'd go to, and I quite enjoyed going to the Sunday masses because the singing was present and it was a spectacle, and again, I was curious what was happening, but by and large, I wasn't really receiving what I would call a spiritual transmission from the priests. It felt like an enactment of quite a cold, dry, repetitive, somewhat boring liturgy and speeches and so forth, and wasn't inspiring me. You know, there'd be occasional talks that some of the priests would give in their attempt to reach out to the boys and personalize it and make it more connecting and relational and present and modern day. But largely, I felt the religious education was very, very dry and dull. Now, what I'd experienced prior to the sexual abuse in my living in the countryside was this freedom and this openness and this engagement in my body and presence and aliveness and sensation, and just aliveness really is the main core of all this. I was presently alive, without questions, without seeking, without sorrow, without wondering, just very engaged and connected in my body. Now, as a 12-year-old, isolated from family, from the familiar, from the feminine, from the earth, from the nature, was moved into a more abstract world, disembodied, became much more intellectually challenging, the study and the rigorousness of this. You know, we work early in the morning till like 8 every evening, and it was like strong, intense intellectual study to create the intellectual leaders out of you, future politicians and so forth. And some of my friends did go that direction. So it's a very different kind of study or emphasis, this looking into the intellect and this pushing away from the body. My experience of my body was relegated, if you like, to on the sports field. We did play lots of sports. I played every sport, rugby, cricket, squash, tennis, hockey. I played all sorts of sports, and it gave me a sense of aliveness, but it was also coupled together with competition and adrenaline and the ideas of team and winning and all these kind of things were wrapped around it. So it wasn't the freedom in the body without the conditional relationship that I'd experienced as a younger child. So religion, let's get back to that. I'll tell you one more experience. Yeah. So at school we all had a dear friend of ours, Charlie Edwards, and he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And there's an invitation to do a healing ceremony for Charlie. And we all loved Charlie. Charlie was a dear, dear friend of all of us in the school. And this news was shocking and troublesome for all of us. And everybody showed up, of course, to this healing ceremony in the Abbey. It was completely packed. And there was such a different energy in there that evening. When we were all there for Charlie, we weren't there for some abstract religion or priesthood or some ideas from the Bible. We were there for Charlie, who was also in the Abbey with us. And I remember that night, that evening, like praying again, like I did that first night when I came into the preparatory school. Praying and praying and praying. And I had this thing where I'd rub my eyes as well, like this. And this somehow produced colours on the eyeballs. Don't press too hard if you do this, but it produces colours, and then I'd see visions and open up to light and all sorts of things. And again, I just felt this unity consciousness happen, and this transmission happen, and this healing happen through me, through all of us, for Charlie. It was like there's this devotion in the space for our friend. And it was personal. It was about him. It was about love. It was about friendship. And Charlie, who was given like a few months to live for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. And I really do genuinely believe something miraculous happened that evening with all of us there. But I would not associate that with a religion. I'd say there was a spiritual transmission happened out of the purity of the love from our hearts. So let me make a few distinctions now. Why am I calling death religion and the birth of the spiritual? What have I realized through my own living experience of this Catholic upbringing, if you like, in the church from age 12? Now, what I noticed again and again and again was a lack of example. As a parent, now I'm a parent, you realize that the only real teaching for your children is by example. You can say whatever you want about boundaries or ideas or ideals, but if you're not demonstrating them, then the child can't learn through osmosis, through imitation, through energy, through transmission. So to be the living example is absolutely essential in my view and feeling. So if you're giving a teaching about something, how I see it now, and I've always sensed this, is that you have to be the teaching. Then you get a genuine respect and a genuine listening. If you're not the living teaching, if it's not living inside of you, then it becomes more of a command, an instruction, a dogma, something evangelical, a preaching, a trying, an enforcing. And you can feel that push, that willful push that often would come with religious teachings. I've learned to call this outside-in teaching. This is not just about religion, it's about everything. Politics, philosophy, the whole conditioning process. So hopefully you can listen on a collective level, universal level, where you can start to recognize this outside-in teaching, instruction. Well, we're not feeling something, but somebody else believes it to be true, and they think it's good for us. So it's drilled into us through repetition, time and again. And not only is the teaching driven in, there's also conditions attached to it. Now in the religious game, guilt is one of those things which is attached to it. This sense of fear is often attached to it. This sense of belittling you, that there's Jesus the Christ and there's us lowly humans and we should all aspire to be like the great Savior. We're all born from original sin. I mean, what kind of starting point is that? You're born broken. and you have to seek salvation with someone who's outside of you. So it's completely disempowering. This outside-in approach, it breeds reliance and dependency. And of course, that jumps the priesthood, who then takes on the role of the parent to give you the instruction and to be the external authority. And this obedience, all these behavioral codes that come with it. So you set upon this apparent religious path, which is really a conditional instructional path, with behavioral codes and consequences, fears and punishments, and told again and again and again, drilled into really what mounts up to trying to make you into a civilized human being. Now I ask you this, is a civilized human being a spiritual being? Or is it just somebody who's just been conditioned in certain behavioral forms? And I can tell you this because I've learned a lot about being a good boy and doing the right thing, and it's all playing the system. It's like you're behaving in a certain way. I certainly was behaving a certain way for a while of my life, trying to get something, recognizing that being good was more efficient than being bad. We get a better response, more rapport. And so you start using goodness as a manipulation. Now I want to make this distinction clearly, hopefully you can hear this, between morality and ethics. Now I genuinely believe that each one of us has a natural, bubbling, champagne-like goodness about us that's inherent. And Matthew Fox, creation spirituality priest, talks about original blessing and creation spirituality, that we're born from the original blessing, not born from original sin, that we really are made in the image of life, not an old man in the sky, but made in the image of life that's naturally, inherently creative, love, joy, bliss, and wonder. This is our starting place. Now this is what I call ethics. An ethical foundation is something which is already here. It can be cultivated and developed and expanded and amplified, but the seed is already here of this great oak tree of love and beauty and wonder. Now morality takes a very different approach. Morality has this assumption that you're a sinner, there's something wrong with you need fixing and changing and controlling, and that you need these commandments or rules or things to obey, because essentially you're stupid. You're like a child that needs to be told what to do because you've got no intelligence to work it out for yourself. And the priesthood and the authority of the church, who can excommunicate you and punish you in all sorts of ways, and is the authority that's going to drill this into you so you follow these moral codes, which are disguised as human values. So you've got all these apparent Christians trying to be good and do good and charitable works and kind things, but it's all coming from an orientation. I'm not saying all of it's coming from there, but a large part of it is coming from this orientation of trying to be a good, moral, civilized citizen, behaving well, in this belief that in some future time you'll be invited into the paradise in some magical way. Jesus will come down from the heavens and collect the good and the righteous, and you'll be saved. What about the rest of humanity? What about all the rest of your brothers and sisters? Where's this idea come from, separation, that you're the chosen ones? And that's suggesting that you're better than the others, superiority, that you have some sensation of, deserving, which is more important than anybody else's the experience of deserving. I don't think so. This is something I love about Buddhism, if you like, and I'm not saying I'm a Buddhist, but a principle from Buddhism of the Bodhisattva who's here for the enlightenment of all human beings, all sentient beings. It doesn't claim enlightenment for him or herself. It's here in service with the total of humanity, the total of the life experience. So not this kind of selfish orientation, I'm going to get to heaven by myself by being a good boy or a good girl and follow the rules, and I'll get rewarded. And it's so self-obsessed, it's so self-oriented. This morality punishment game treats us like Pavlov's dogs, punishments and rewards. Now, hopefully you can hear clearly I do not believe in this or subscribe to this or have any adherence to this at all. This distinction between morality and ethics is really important to grasp and understand, and it changes everything, and certainly has done for me. To recognize that prior to when I was 0 to 12, I was living in an ethical way of being, a natural intelligence, love, joy, beauty, bliss, openness, spontaneity, creativity, intuition, instincts was all operating and flowing perfectly, happily, easily with me. And then comes the conditional force of the intellect, which is separated out, was forced out of us in public school, where we were forced to look at the world of ideas and other people's knowledge and morality and the conditions of the church, and trained, forced, manipulated to be good people to all outer appearances. So this is what I call an outside-in approach, dogmatic approach, conditional approach, fear-based approach. An inside-out approach is one of revelation. As I said earlier, as a 12-year-old, I started asking questions to the abbot, didn't get any responses. So I looked inside, started to meditate spontaneously, started to be in a consideration of finding my own answers inside myself. So I would sit, I would breathe, I would close my eyes, and I'd do all this spontaneously. It's like I would go into a space of inner communion and listen, largely listening, feeling, opening, with curiosity and attentiveness. And I received many of my answers to questions in dreams and feelings and inspirations, and my notebooks were filled up with questions and curiosity and explorations. So I started to really engage in this subjective interior looking within, looking to self, looking to my own ethical response, and expanding beyond the intellect, listening to other forms of intelligence, inspirational intelligence, illuminative intelligence, the intelligence of intuition, instinctual intelligence. And all this became my natural way of being. I would start from the heart. I would start from within. So quite early on, I didn't need a rule-based system to control me or guide me or instruct me. I couldn't see the sense in it. I was being guided and instructed by people who weren't a living example of this. There were priests in our school, later we found out were also sexual abusers, and it was made public on some documentary. They were there at the time that we were at school. I wasn't aware of it at the time. And this is the story a lot in Christianity, this sexual deviance that happens. To be honest, when I was looking at the monks, I didn't see much joy. I'd see quietness and inwardness, a disconnect, lack of engagement, and this obsession with instructing people from conditional reality, from thoughts, from beliefs, from ideas. So I didn't have this experience of being blessed, or being seen, or being heard, or being met, or being in a space of realization together, or the celebration of the life. It always felt someday, one day, somewhere else. If you follow these rules, behave according to these guidelines, then one day, someday, maybe you'll be a good person, you'll get into heaven. Or you'll be a good moral person, you'll have a good life. Yeah? Now what I've come to realize is all of this is the matrix. All of this is the conditional reality. Outside-in instruction. Now this is something which is often called the exoteric form of religion. Right, the outer form of religion, which is the prayers, the rules, the morality, the ceremonies, the church itself, the ideas of the church. This is the exoteric. Exo meaning outside, is the visible. And the esoteric is your inner experience of what Christianity, esoteric Christianity calls it gnosis, direct knowing, direct wisdom, subjective. It's about your meditation, your time in the wilderness, your vision quest, your prayer. Where you're not looking to go through the priest or through morality or through the church or through the sacred temple, but you, in the midst of your own presence, have direct communion with the deity. It's a process of self-realization. So in Christianity, it's called gnosis. This is also called that state of nirvana, or samadhi, or enlightenment, or satori. It's got lots of different names for this inner state of illumination that is part of our natural human experience of waking up to who we are. Now, Jesus did refer to this, if it was Jesus, the second birth, or the birth of the Christ consciousness. The first birth is through your mother's vaginal canal. Second birth is the birth of consciousness, waking up to a deeper state of who and how we really are. So we come out of the slumber of the conditional matrix. We come out of the slumber of the manipulated reality, the outside-in approach. We suddenly start to see very, very clearly the domination and control and behavioral codes and guilt and shame and repression and fear and punishment and all the stuff that's been wrapped around us, living in this open prison, and with the ward guards all around us with their moral teachings and whips and punishments of this crusade of you're a sinner, you need to be fixed and healed and saved, and I'm going to do it for you. In contrast with all this is the inside-out approach, which is one of meditation, communion. It's the direct experience. And this is what I'm referring to as the spiritual. It's subjective. It's about your honest, present experience, as opposed to an idea-based fantasy, an idea-based belief, an idea-based value system or morality or behavioral codes. Yeah, they're so radically different. So the exoteric, the outer form, the esoteric, the inner experience. Now I'm calling this video The Death of Religion because for me, the exoteric was a lie, was a facade, wasn't useful, wasn't serving the esoteric realization. I didn't see examples. I didn't get answers to questions. I saw perversion in the priesthood. I see political manipulation in the church. I see power and greed and misuse of money, misuse of ideas, and people blindly in service, in slavery to this external priesthood and church and outer form, without questions, without challenge. Fear of being kicked out of the cult of religion. So amusing that people call these other things cults. Religion is the biggest cult there is. Mind control, manipulation, domination, fear, all the things that people talk about in other cults, is happening pretty much all the time in the religious institutions. So for me, I couldn't honestly, with open heart, look to this and say, this is serving me, this is useful for me. Thank you for your guidance. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your teaching. The experience I related to earlier in this video about my first experience of prayer and this Ouija board experience of intuition and this experience with Charlie, this prayer healing ceremony and Gregorian chanting. For me, in those moments, there was not the conditional reality of the church, of an idea of religion. There was the direct transmission of expanded states of consciousness and energy that occurred through the intensity of my desire in the prayer, through my devotion, which occurred through the upliftment of the song, the vibration of the song in the chanting, which occurred in the healing transmission with the absolute love, for Charlie, all this space on the first day I prayed, this calling for support deep in my heart. These were the keys. And all of these keys were keys that I produced. They were internal keys. They weren't to do with the religion. They were to do with me flipping a switch beyond the mind, beyond the story, beyond the emotion, and opening up to something which is greater, more expansive, more illuminated, more wise, more joyful, more loving, more blessing. And as I said to you, I practiced meditation when I was quite young, almost when I was 12, I think I remember meditating spontaneously. I was creating all sorts of different meditations, and the deeper I'd relax in my consciousness and energy, the more I would expand. Then later I went on to study my dreams and the symbols of dreams and altered states of consciousness, and later on I'd go to study shamanism and yogic meditation practice, and then I went off to the jungle to work with medicine plants, and then I worked with ecstatic dance and tantra and Sufism and many different esoteric practices that give you the direct experience. The direct experience. Now I want to come full circle here, because from the direct experience, from my experience, it's then possible to describe this. That's what I'm doing in this video. I'm describing certain aspects I've seen. I'm putting into in certain, not categories, fixed categories, but I'll give them certain descriptions to help the understanding of these experiences. But there's an aliveness in the communication because it's coming from a direct experience that I've had that lives inside of me, that belongs to me. So it's not secondhand knowledge. It's not me faking it or pretending it or imagining it or hoping for it or having faith in it. It's something I've lived or am living. So I'm communicating from the example of the experience. Now from the example, you then find the intellectual words and language and descriptions to give a flavor of the experience. So it's not a hard box of belief that says this is the truth. You start to recognize that the exoteric forms can be useful when you start to see them as like fluid membranes, if you like. You know, like a cell membrane that's holding the container of this experience that you have. It's a descriptive attempt to describe the indescribable a lot of the time. So what this has shown me again and again is not to get into a space of externalizing and attaching to rigid beliefs and giving the belief power, giving all the emphasis to the experiential, and then enjoying the elaboration of that in words, which might sound like their beliefs. But these aren't beliefs with fixed, rigid attachments and behavioral codes and punishments and rewards. Yeah? Which is what religion, and that's what I call the death of religion, it's really the disconnection from the esoteric. I genuinely believe there was a time in the early church where often the priests were priestesses, women priests and priestesses who were giving the transmission of the Holy Spirit. And I sense this aliveness that would be happening in this initial stage of the early church when Jesus was around, the revelation pouring from the Master, having an effect on the others through example, and then being initiated into their own hearts, their own greatness, and their own Holy Spirit fire, and then transmitting that to others, disciples and devotees. So there's definitely a place where the esoteric and the exoteric can be complementary. So for me, this is something where we can begin to look at ourselves and recognize where we've been manipulated and dominated and controlled by exoteric forms. I've lost touch with our meaning, lost touch with our heart, our deeper feeling, our essence, our spiritual nature. So my invitation to you is to pour your energy back into your own heart awareness. Get present in the love you already are. Rediscover your original blessing, or whatever you want to call it, your natural sacredness, your intrinsic aliveness. Whatever brings you the joy, the depth, the passion, the engagement, the aliveness. Give time to that. That's your prayer. That's where you find your link with spirit and deepen into that and merge with that and let that become you, your foundation. And then from there, enjoy the poetry, enjoy the writing, the painting, the descriptions, the books, whatever you want to do, as a way of communicating that with the world through the exoteric forms, so they become one whole circle. In my sense, in this way, each man, each woman is a religion unto themselves. Yeah? The religion of the heart, the essence of the spiritual heart, that then portrays itself through forms. Now, we don't need churches, we don't need morality, we don't need a priesthood, we don't need a tradition, we don't need a dogmatism, we don't need commandments or the rules or fear or punishment. None of that, in my experience, has ever been useful. It's only provoked a reaction to that in the denial of what is actually true about me in my heart as a human being. Now, I do sense it could be possible that we could start to get more and more clear about our communication and open up ways so the esoteric and the exoteric are in one dance together. Our inner experience and our outer language are unified and harmonized. And this, I do feel, has happened in some religious experiences. In the past, there would have been an aliveness of the Holy Spirit, of the life force, or the prana, of the luminosity, would be in the middle of the prayers, in the middle of the songs, in the inspiration from the priest or the priesthood. And it would be a service of celebration, collaboration, communication, which deepens into communion. But when fear comes in, manipulation comes in, control comes in, and no example of the living love and light and beauty, then there's no interest for me at all in the religious form. Which is why, in my personal experience, the death of religion, the death of Catholicism, has had to happen to liberate me, to come back to my own spiritual heart. And I'm completely at peace with this. It's taken me some time, a wrestling match of, can I step out of this? There's these fears of stepping out of any kind of cult, this betrayal, this like, I'm doing something wrong. I'm like the black swan. I'm not allowed to do this. I'll be, the fear of God and all that stuff. I had to kind of decondition myself to let go of all of that stuff, those entrapments of ideas and conditions that try and keep you contained in this prison of ideas. And for me, at the end of the day, in the middle of the day, the only thing that's important is love, beauty, truth, wisdom, community, devotion, and the joy and the gratitude for being alive. So for me, this is the heart of what I call the spiritual life. Thank you for listening. Hope it's useful for you in either gets you asking questions or exploring or examining or deepening into your own experience. And I offer meditations and guidance and coaching and all sorts of things, and very happy to support you and deeply connecting to the fire in your heart. Your own passionate presence. This is who I am being and becoming and expanding into more every day. And want to inspire and offer and resonate this with other people through the example, so you can see yourself clearly reflected. So this is my journey. This is my offering. This is where I am. Thank you very, very much for listening, and wishing you a great day wherever you are in the world, wherever you are in your life, wherever you are in your heart. A deep prayer for your heart fire to make itself known, and for you to trust in this inner fire, to trust in the wisdom of the life and the light and the beauty and the love and the joy and the wonder that you are. So, thank you very much. Bye-bye for now.